I started my diet at the beginning of the summer. I always knew that I needed to lose some weight, but I didn't really do anything about it until my girlfriend Lucy confronted me. She said that I'd let myself go and she was no longer attracted to me. This came as a huge shock because Lucy and I had been together for just over 3 years and I'd never heard her complain about my weight before. I guess she'd been frustrated for a while, but she'd kept everything to herself until she couldn't anymore. Elisa did everything she could to help me out. She even created a diet and exercise plan. I didn't want to lose her, so I followed her plan to a T. It was easy at first, and I was dropping weight pretty fast. But after a month, I really started to struggle. I had no energy, and I was constantly hungry. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my own growling stomach. I was starving. I snuck out of bed, careful not to wake Lucy up, and I went into the kitchen to look for snacks. Unfortunately, Lucy had already thrown away all the snacks in the house. Instead, our fridge was filled with pre-made meals. They were all labeled with days of the week, so if I ate anything, Lucy would know right away. There was only one thing I could do. I grabbed my wallet and I walked to the McDonald's restaurant a couple blocks away. It was open 24 hours. I knew I was breaking my diet big time, but I couldn't stop myself. I went straight to the restaurant and pigged out on 2 Big Macs and some fries. I ate it all so fast that my stomach hurt. In a way, this was the best meal of my life. My body needed the calories. But, on the other hand, I felt absolutely guilty for going behind Lucy's back. I promised myself that I would never do that again. I slowly walked back home, feeling completely stuffed. As I turned back onto our dark suburban street, I saw someone hiding in our neighbor's bushes. A little scared, I walked closer. I got a better look at the man in the bushes. He was an older guy with a bald head and a little gray goatee. I'd never seen this man before in my life. Well, the man was dragging something across the yard. It was wrapped in a plastic tarp, but I could tell from its shape that this was a dead body. The man was a murderer, and I'd just caught him hiding a body. I stood there frozen, too shocked to move. All I could do was stare as the man dragged the body into the back of his truck. He tossed it into the back and then drove off. Thankfully, he never saw me staring. I reached into my pocket to grab my phone and call the police, but then I realized that I didn't bring my phone with me. So I hurried back inside. Lucy was still sleeping peacefully in our bed. My phone sat on the end table right next to her. If I grabbed it, I knew that Lucy would wake up. And that's when I made the biggest mistake of my life. Instead of reporting the murder, I got back into the bed and tried to forget about what I saw. I know it was my duty to report the crime, but if I did, well, then Lucy would know that I'd snuck out of the house and broken my diet. I couldn't let that happen. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, waiting futilely for sleep to come. By the time our morning alarm went off, I hadn't slept a wink. As Lucy made my breakfast oatmeal, she could tell that I was upset and sleep-deprived. She asked me if everything was okay, and I lied right to her face. For the next few days, I felt so guilty. I had this big, horrible secret, and there was no one I could talk to. Eventually, I just convinced myself that nothing had happened. I'd imagined everything. And then Saturday rolled around, and a policeman appeared at our doorstep. He was an elderly bald man with thick glasses. He introduced himself as Officer Moretti and said that he was looking into a missing persons case. He said that our neighbor, Jim, has been gone for the last 3 days. I didn't know Jim by name, but I assumed he was the dead body. And that's when I gave in and confessed everything. I gave Officer Moretti a description of the man. He asked me why I didn't come forward earlier, and I told him that I was ashamed for breaking my diet. Just as I finished confessing everything, I noticed a strange look on the policeman's face. He was weirdly angry. Then I realized that I'd seen this face before. This was the man I'd seen the other night, the man hiding the body. He didn't have a goatee anymore, but it was still the same guy. And now he knew that I saw him. He stepped closer, his face falling in shadow, and he whispered, "Try to watch out. You never know when someone like that might come back." And then he was gone. I went back inside, completely numb. Lucy was already in the living room when I re-entered. She saw the look on my face and asked me if everything was okay. I couldn't hide it anymore. I started to tell her everything, including how I broke my diet. Before I could get to the murder part, she stopped me. "I can't believe you cheated on your diet!" she shouted. "After all the work I've done?" I tried to tell her the rest of the story, but by that point she refused to listen. She was so focused on my McDonald's dinner. Eventually, she told me to leave. "Go get another Big Mac or two, I don't mind." I awkwardly left. Like she told me, I went back to McDonald's, but I was too upset to eat. I just sat there, thinking about how I could get my girlfriend to believe me. I was gone for less than an hour, but when I got back home, the front door was open and the house was empty. I couldn't find Lucy anywhere. I rushed outside, worried that the killer had come back, when I saw my neighbor Denise walking her dog. I ran over and asked if she'd seen my girlfriend. "Yeah, I did," she said. "She was talking to that nice policeman. I just saw them get in his truck." I drove straight to the police station after that. I told them about Officer Moretti, and the cop on duty gave me a very sad look. There's no one with that name in our department. I haven't seen Lucy ever since.
This happened a few years back. I had just gotten my first job at Dunkin' Donuts, and I really wanted to impress my bosses. I was by far the hardest worker there, always on call for the morning rush, and I quickly got to know all our regulars by name. Most of them were extremely nice, and a few were excellent tippers. But I had one customer who really stood out. His name was Steve, and he worked at an IT company just down the street. He came in every Friday morning to get donuts for his office. Steve was usually polite, but he always seemed so stressed out. When I tried to ask him about work, he literally got shaky. I guess he was a new hire, and his bosses kept loading more responsibilities on his plate. I could definitely sympathize, even though my job at Dunkin' was much less stressful than his. I felt sorry for him. Then one Friday, I sold Steve his donuts and then went outside for a smoke break. I stood near the dumpsters because I didn't want any customers to see. That's when I noticed that Steve was still in his car. He sat in the driver's seat talking to himself. It looked like he was psyching himself up before another difficult workday. This was obviously a private moment, so I didn't want to look. But just as I was turning away, I saw Steve pull out a can of something from his glove compartment. Then he opened the box I just sold him and sprinkled something onto the donuts. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then he drove off. I heard a loud clink as he left. A little confused, I walked over to where his car was parked and I saw the can rolling on the asphalt. Steve must have thrown it out the window as he drove off. I got close enough to read the label. It was rat poison, and he just sprinkled it all over his coworkers' donuts. He was going to kill them all. With shaky fingers, I pulled out my phone and called 911. It rang and rang, but no one answered. Wasn't there supposed to be a dispatcher on call at all times? I couldn't wait any longer, so I shoved my phone back into my pocket and started running down the street. I knew exactly where Steve worked, and it was only 2 blocks away. I ran faster than I ever had before, and pretty soon I'd reached Steve's building. I was panting and soaked with sweat. Through the window, I could see the box of poisoned donuts sitting on a table. It was already open, but none of the donuts were missing yet. Thank God. I pushed my way into the building and was immediately stopped by the front guard. His badge said Patrick. He was massive with both muscle and fat. I obviously couldn't shove my way past him. "Why are you here?" he demanded. I told him everything about Kevin and the poisoned donuts. His expression instantly changed. "We have to get those donuts right now. Come with me." He grabbed my arm and escorted me through the turnstile and into the main office. We hurried past cubicles, not saying a word. Eventually, he opened the door to a conference room and charged inside. I was right behind. That's when I realized that he hadn't taken me to the donuts at all. He'd led me in the exact opposite direction. I couldn't do anything though, because he closed the door behind him and blocked my exit with his massive body. "Steve and I had a plan," he explained. "We're not going to let you stop us." "But everyone's going to die!" Just then the door opened again. I felt relief wash over me, expecting to see another worker who could run and get help. But then my hopes faded as I realized that Steve had just entered. He glared at me and then turned toward his partner. "I think it's time for a change of plans. Forget the receptionist. We can pin the murders on this idiot, a nameless little minimum wager who just flipped for no reason." "You can't do that!" I screamed. "I'll tell everyone. I'll make them believe me." "Then I guess we'll have to shut you up first." He pulled out a donut that he'd been hiding behind his back and slowly stepped toward me. Before I knew it, he'd lunged forward, shoving the donut into my closed mouth. He squeezed my nose, forcing me to open my mouth, and when I did, he shoved in the whole donut and forced my jaw to chew. My mouth was filled with poison, but I refused to swallow. If I could just hold off long enough. Suddenly, the door flung open and a policeman ran in. He pulled Steve away from me and I spat everything onto the carpet. Steve and his accomplice didn't put much up of a fight, so the cop cuffed them both and left. He came back in a few minutes later to thank me for the quick thinking. If I hadn't kept my phone call running, they wouldn't have heard the full confession. I reached into my pocket and sure enough, my phone was still connected to 911. I said, "Thank you," to whoever was listening and ended the call. The policeman guided me out of the conference room. As we made it through the main office, he angled his body to block my view. There was something he didn't want me to see. Of course, I looked anyway and saw 2 office workers lying dead on the ground. I guess they'd eaten the donuts before help could arrive. I'd saved a lot of people that day, but I couldn't save those 2.
My name is Kristen. I'm 26 years old and I just got dumped by my boyfriend of 2 years, Ryan. We met in a creative writing class. I really thought that he was the one. All of my friends and family did too. The breakup came completely out of nowhere. One afternoon we were sitting on the couch watching an action movie, and then he turned on me and said that he'd met someone else and it was over. It took him 3 hours to pack up all of his stuff and leave, and he didn't even say a real goodbye. He just said, "See ya," and hurried off. This hit me really hard. Not only did I lose the love of my life, but all my friends and family loved him too. Every time someone asked me how Ryan was doing, I had to tell them the same story, which meant I had to relive the pain over and over again. Eventually, I decided to make one big announcement on social media. I decided to use TikTok because I knew that all of my family was on it. I won't tell you my handle, but I'm reasonably popular on the book talk community. I mostly made videos staging conversations between John Austen's side characters. If you're into that kind of stuff, you've probably seen me. If not, you have absolutely no idea who I am. What I really liked about TikTok, especially in the literary fan circles, was the most engagement was extremely positive and supportive. The comments on my videos were usually nice, and I've been able to make some really good connections because of it. Things changed when I posted my video about my breakup. I explained everything that happened, trying to stay as accurate as possible. I tried not to cry, but I couldn't help it. I posted my multi-part video and waited for the flood of supportive comments to wash in. The first few were pretty good, hang in there and whatever. But then someone posted, "This is so funny." A few more people sent a bunch of laughing emojis. Pretty soon my comments were flooded with people laughing at me, as if my breakup was some kind of big joke to them. One comment really jumped out at me. It was from a woman named Beth, another book talk influencer, and she wrote, "This is a creative way to talk about love matters most. Good job." Love matters most. You probably recognize the title. It's one of those chicklet books from a while back that everyone went bonkers for. I never read that kind of stuff, so I didn't really understand what she was talking about. I closed my TikTok and did a quick search on Love Matters Most. It took me to the wiki page, which had a pretty thorough synopsis of the novel. As soon as I read the first sentence, I knew something weird was going on. The entire book was telling my life story. The main character, also named Kristen, she also blogged about Jane Austen. In the book, she meets a man named Ryan in the exact same way I met my ex Ryan. At the end of the book, Ryan leaves Kristen just like in real life, and all the things they did during their relationship were the same, things that Ryan and I did. Paragliding, getting food poisoning on Christmas, saying goodbye to his dying grandmother. Love Matters Most was 100% based on our lives. So when I made my breakup announcement, everyone just thought that I was doing a performance based on the book. At first, I thought Ryan had secretly written the novel under a pen name, but that didn't make any sense because Love Matters Most was published months before Ryan and I started dating. I was deeply confused, and the only person who could answer my questions was Ryan. I called him, but he didn't answer. I went to his work, but they told me that he quit. I texted everyone I knew, but no one had heard from him. I didn't know where else to look, so I went back home and tried to forget about it. In the 2 weeks that followed, my breakup video became my highest viewed video so far. I somehow lucked into a cool new format for my videos. From then on, I started posting really tearful, emotional book videos from the point of view of the main characters. It really worked for me, and that's all I do on my channel now. I've got more subscribers than ever. Despite that, I was still deeply frustrated. I thought about Ryan constantly, wondering how our relationship could be so similar to that book that neither of us read. 8 months after the breakup, I finally got my answer. A letter appeared in my mail inviting me to a movie premiere. It was for a documentary, but it didn't say the name. I had nothing better to do, so I decided to go. I was still single and felt a bit lonely. There wasn't a big red carpet or anything. I presented my invitation and sat in the back row of a completely empty theater. When the movie started to play, Ryan's face appeared on the screen, but he didn't introduce himself as Ryan. He said his name was George, and he spoke with a British accent. On the screen, George explained that he was going to take the absolute trashiest, best-selling novel he could find and see if he could recreate it in real life. He chose Love Matters Most, took on the persona Ryan, and then went out to find a real-life Kristen. That's how he found me. I watched in horror as the film showed footage of us meeting in our creative writing class. The scene played out from all angles. There must have been hidden cameras everywhere in that classroom. The rest of the film was more of the same. George would give a little interview, then I'd see footage of my life. He'd hidden cameras and microphones everywhere when we were still dating, including our bedroom. The worst part was watching him break up with me through the camera that must have been hiding behind my couch. That was the last scene in the movie, followed by one more interview with George. He was gloating about how his experiment worked and how he was able to recreate a crappy paperback nearly perfectly. The credits rolled and George, walked to the front of the stage. With his real accent, he apologized for having to trick me. "But you have to admit, we made a great film." I didn't say anything. He handed me a contract to sign, explaining that he couldn't release the film without my permission. I ripped up the contract and left. Since that moment, I haven't thought about Ryan once. I finally moved on.
I've been in love with photography since my high school photography class. I took it begrudgingly because I needed an art credit, but I quickly fell in love with it. Something about capturing a breathtaking moment and being able to share it with others excited me. I don't do it professionally, but I did consider it. Instead, I decided it's best just as a hobby. I usually photograph landscapes. Up until I bought the camera, I just used my iPhone since the quality was impressive. My mom was the one who suggested I take the leap and buy a real camera. She's always worried about my lack of hobbies, so she encourages me to invest in what I enjoy. I'm stingy, so I usually shrug off this type of advice, but this time I listened. I started watching TikToks about photographers and how they use their cameras. It inspired me. My mom told me she thought eBay might be a good place to buy one at a reasonable price. I scoured the internet, and did all the research until I found the exact model I wanted, a Canon EOS 90D DSLR with an 18 to 135mm lens. This way, I could take smaller pictures and large landscapes. I started looking around online, and my mom was right. I found one on eBay for about half the cost of a new one. I looked at the seller's history, and there was none. The name looked like it was auto-generated. I assumed they just made the account to sell the camera only, and I placed a bid. No one challenged me, so before I knew it, I got an email confirming my purchase and telling me the camera should take 10 business days to ship. It's kind of embarrassing, but I checked the mail every day until it came. I was so excited. After a week, there was a package in my mailbox. I ripped through the cardboard and bubble wrap to reveal the Canon camera, gleaming under the dim light of my living room. It had that satisfying heft that only older cameras seem to have. I felt like I'd scored big. The memory card was still inside, an old SD card, smaller in storage than most people use these days, but I figured the previous owner probably forgot to remove it. Curious, I decided to check out the pictures. Who knows, maybe I'd find some cool landscapes or candid street shots. I powered up the camera and navigated to the gallery. The first few photos were random shots of city streets, park benches, and a cat sleeping on a windowsill. But the next image made my stomach twist. It was a photo of a man, probably in his early 30s, sitting at a bar. His face was caught in a moment of surprise, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. The image was grainy, the lighting bad, but there was something off about it. Something about his expression that made me feel like I shouldn't be seeing this. I clicked the next photo. Same bar, different angle. This time the man's head was slumped forward on the bar, a thin stream of blood trickling from his temple. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. Was this a joke? Some sick prank? I clicked through the photos rapidly. More images of the same man, but now his body was on the floor, limbs splayed out unnaturally, blood pooling beneath him. I felt like I was in shock. My stomach was twisted in knots, but something compelled me to keep looking through the SD card. There were a few more normal photos before I was introduced to a pretty blonde woman in a park. The photos started at a distance and slowly got closer and closer to the woman, until there was another shocked, up-close portrait. The woman looked angry. The next photo was her lying on the ground face down with a little blood on the grass around her head. The photos progressed until her body was shoved in a trash bag. Seeing her limbs mangled and crowded in a bag caused the knots in my stomach to rumble. I ran to the bathroom to vomit. My head hung over the toilet frozen as the gravity of what I was seeing hit me. These weren't just creepy photos. These were pictures of an actual murder. I felt bile rise in my throat. Who the hell had I bought this camera from? I slammed the camera down and jumped on my laptop, immediately logging into eBay. I pulled up the seller's profile, only to be met with an error message. User does not exist. How could they have deleted their account so quickly? It had only been a week since I bought the camera. I had to take this to the police. I didn't bother calling because I needed to show the cops what I was looking at. It was the only way they'd take me seriously. I grabbed the camera and my keys and headed out to my car. I drove to the nearest police station, speeding the entire way. When I pulled into a parking spot, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short. "You're next." I stared at the message, unable to move. Whoever had taken these photos knew I had the camera. They knew where I lived. My hand shook as I typed a reply. "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly. "Doesn't matter. I'm close." Another message popped up. "Do you think the cops can save you?" My heart pounded against my chest. I could feel sweat forming at my hairline. I didn't respond and rushed into the station. With haste, I approached the front desk. "I need to talk to someone about a murder," I blurted out. The lady cop sitting at the front desk could see my urgency. "Can you tell me a little bit about it so I can know who to direct you to?" I kept looking over my shoulder as I recounted the story to her, telling her about the images in the text. She nodded and said, "Let me get you Detective Lowry." She picked up the phone and said a quick few words, and then led me back to Lowry. Lowry was an older gentleman with white hair and a strong mustache. He must have had decades of experience. "Sit down, son," he instructed me. I sat beside his desk. "Tell me about these murders." I told him the same story I had told the lady cop at the front desk. Lowry listened intently and nodded, so I knew he was paying attention. I pulled out the camera and showed him the images. He furrowed his brow in concern. "Listen, son, you did the right thing coming here. Unfortunately, there isn't much we can do since we can't confirm that these murders happened locally. You said you bought this off eBay, and that you don't know where the potential killer is located?" I nodded my head. "What I can do is have a protective detail stationed outside your house in case whoever texted you comes around. How does that sound?" "Sounds better than nothing," I responded. "If this person rears their head, we'll get them. Am I bait?" Lowry shrugged. "You're all we can go off of. Whether you want it or not, someone is watching you. We're doing what we can to protect you, and if you turn out luring this murder out into the open, I see it as us seizing an opportunity. Are you okay with that?" "I guess I have to be." I gave Lowry my address and left the station. Right as I stepped outside, I felt my phone buzz again. "Do you think a detective will save you?" My eyes leered at the smiley face. Whoever this person was, they were sadistic. I looked around and saw no one paying attention to me. I scurried to my car and drove back to my home. When I pulled up to my complex, there was already a cop car stationed outside. Right when I entered my apartment and closed the door behind me, I heard a thud and felt a dull pain at the back of my head. My knees went weak, and everything went foggy as I fell to the ground. When I opened my eyes, I heard snaps of a camera. They were bright, blinding flashes. I heard a man laughing. My hands were bound behind me. I was tied to a chair. I looked around. I was in my apartment. There was a man with a camera pointed at me, taking pictures. His hands with the camera dropped to his waist, revealing his face. He was a greasy man of about 40. He barely had any hair, and he combed it over his bald scalp to make it look like he had more than he did. It was doing the opposite of what he wanted. His teeth were yellow, and he had beady brown eyes. "Enjoying the camera?" he asked. I struggled to free my hands, but luckily, the creep didn't think of tying up my legs. I looked around for my phone and saw it in the man's pocket. The man came closer. He was babbling on about something about capturing life's fleeting moments. I wasn't listening because I was formulating a plan. The man inched closer and closer until I whispered something. "What was that?" The man stepped closer and leaned in to hear me. I knocked my head against his, and he fell back. Then I kicked him in the nuts. The murderer lurched over to grab his and then I kicked him hard in the face. The man fell back like a tree. He was out cold. I hobbled with a chair tied to my arms over to his passed-out body. I sat beside him, kicked off my shoes, and took off my sock with my toes. I pushed my phone out of his pocket, and with my bare toes, I fiddled with it until the emergency response came up. I dialed 911 and yelled for help when the operator answered. I told them my address. It was minutes until a cop was knocking on my door. He busted down my door and saw the scene. The cop immediately went to the murderer's side and rolled him over to cuff him before untying me. They waited until the man came to before taking him out to the cop car. The man's name was Thomas. He was convicted for 2 murders and an attempted murder. He will be locked up till his last day. I bought a new memory card and am still using the camera. It took me a while before I had the courage to leave its bloody past behind and use it. Looking back, I'm happy I bought the camera. Someone else may not have been so lucky. I woke up to the sound of shuffling in the hallway. At first, it was faint, barely a whisper of movement. But it grew louder, more distinct. I lay there, heart racing, trying to make sense of it. It was Robbie. Again. Robbie had been in a car accident last year. Since then, he hadn't walked. At least not during the day. From the waist down, he was paralyzed. But at night, something else happened. He would rise from his bed, eyes wide open but distant, his legs, useless by day, somehow carrying him down the hall, sleepwalking. I didn't know whether to call it a miracle or a curse. The first time I saw it, I thought I was dreaming. There he was, standing, swaying, as if the world had given him back his legs for a moment. But his face, it was vacant, slack, a mask of something I couldn't quite place. He would move aimlessly, slow and deliberate, until I'd wake him, and he'd collapse, unable to move again. Robbie didn't like to talk about it. During the day, he was filled with a bitterness that radiated off him like heat. He used to be different, active, full of life. He was always the guy running, laughing, chasing his dreams with everything he had. But the accident had taken it all away. Now, he barely left the apartment. His legs were dead weight, and so it seemed, was a spirit. I could see the anger in him. It festered. He hated his body, hated himself, and hated anyone who could still walk. "You don't understand," he'd say, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what it's like to be trapped in this prison." And he was right. I didn't understand. But it was more than just the loss of his legs that ate at him. It was the loss of his independence, his freedom, and I think something deeper, something darker. One night, the shuffling sound was louder than usual. I got out of bed and crept down the hall, trying to be as quiet as possible. There he was, standing in the middle of the living room, his back to me. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. Robbie wasn't just sleepwalking this time. He was moving with purpose. His hands reached out in front of him, fingers twitching, as if grasping for something I couldn't see. "Robbie?" I whispered, but he didn't respond. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. His breathing was heavy, almost labored, and his body was tense. It was like he was trying to fight something, or someone. Suddenly, he turned toward me, his eyes wide open but vacant. I froze. There was something in his gaze, something cold, something hungry. And then I realized this wasn't Robbie. At least not the Robbie I knew. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step toward me. I backed away, but he kept coming, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I had no idea what to do. This wasn't just sleepwalking anymore. This was something else, something terrifying. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way to snap him out of it, but before I could do anything, he spoke. "You took them from me." His voice was low, almost a growl. I didn't understand what he meant. "Robbie, wake up! This isn't you!" I pleaded, but he just kept coming closer. "You took my legs, and now I'll take yours." I stumbled backward, my blood turning to ice. This wasn't Robbie. This was something inside him, something dark that had been growing ever since the accident. I had seen the anger, the jealousy, the resentment, but I hadn't seen this. The lust for revenge, the desire to take back what had been stolen from him, by any means necessary. Suddenly, he lunged at me, and I screamed. But just as his hands reached out to grab me, he collapsed, his legs giving out beneath him. The spell was broken. I stood there, trembling, watching as he lay on the floor, motionless, unconscious. In the morning, Robbie didn't remember anything. He never did. But I did. And as I looked at him lying there in his wheelchair, staring blankly at the TV, I realized something chilling. Robbie wasn't the only one trapped in his body. Something else was in there with him, something that only came out when the sun went down. And it wanted more than just his legs.
I never wanted to do this. I spent most of my life trying to be the kind of person my mother would be proud of. But sometimes, life twists you into something unrecognizable, something dark and violent, and you find yourself staring at your reflection, unable to comprehend the monster you've become. It all started when I landed my first job after college. Freshly minted with a degree and loaded with optimism, I joined a prestigious marketing firm in the heart of the city. At first, the excitement of a new career masked the underlying rot that permeated the office walls. But as the weeks turned into months, the shine wore off, and the ugly truth revealed itself. Our CEO, Mr. Harding, was the embodiment of everything wrong with capitalism. He was a greedy, manipulative tyrant who saw his employees not as people, but as tools to be exploited for his own gain. I'd sit in meetings, watching him spew corporate jargon with a slimy grin, all while the rest of us struggled to keep up with the unrealistic demands placed upon us. The job quickly consumed my life. I'd wake up at dawn, drag myself to the office, and work until the sun had long gone. My weekends were no better. The constant ping of work emails haunted me, even in my supposed time off. My health deteriorated, my relationships crumbled, and relentless shimmering rage began to build within me. One night, as I sat alone in my dimly lit apartment, drowning in my sorrows and cheap whiskey, I stumbled upon a server on Discord. The posts were a mix of rants, dark humor, and occasionally detailed plans of rebellion. I became a regular, finding solace in the collective hatred shared by the members. But there was one post, one user in particular, who stood out to me. He went by the name Reckoner. His words were sharp, filled with a burning intensity that resonated deeply with me. We started chatting privately, sharing our mutual disdain for the system that enslaved us. He introduced me to others who felt the same, and slowly, an idea began to form. "We need to send a message," Reckoner typed one night. "Not just words, something that will make them truly understand our pain." The idea of finally doing something, of striking back at the source of my misery, was intoxicating. Reckoner proposed a plan that was as bold as it was dangerous. We would target Mr. Harding, not with violence, but with exposure. We'd uncover and release the dirty secrets of his empire, showing the world what the true cost of his greed was. It started with hacking into Harding's personal email. Reckoner was a genius with computers, and within days, we had access to a trove of incriminating evidence. Emails detailing illegal deals, exploitation, and worse. We meticulously compiled everything, creating a dossier that would, well, ruin Harding's reputation and bring his empire down. The night we chose to act was perfect. The air was crisp, the sky clear. Reckoner and I, along with a few others from the forum, met in person for the first time. We sat in a small, dimly lit room, and the weight of our actions were pressing down on us. "Are we ready?" Reckoner asked, with his eyes scanning the room. There were nods in agreement. With a sense of determination, we began the process of releasing the information. We hacked into Harding's social media accounts, posting the dossier for all to see. Within minutes, the posts went viral. I watched the chaos unfold from my apartment, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, Harding's name was plastered across every screen. The public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. But as the hours passed, my exhilaration turned to dread. Harding's response was swift and brutal. He had powerful connections, and it wasn't long before he tracked us down. One by one, my fellow conspirators went silent, disappearing without a trace. Fear gripped me as I realized that I was next. I spent sleepless nights watching my door, every creak and shadow sending my heart racing. I knew I couldn't run forever. Then, one night, there was a knock at my door. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I opened it, and there were two men in suits, their expressions cold and menacing. "Mr. Davis," one of them said to me, his voice like ice. "You need to come with us." They took me to an undisclosed location, a sterile room with bright lights and no windows. Harding himself was there, sitting behind a desk, his face twisted in anger. "You think you can ruin me?" he snarled. "You had no idea who you were dealing with." For hours they questioned me, threatened me, tried to break me, but I refused to give in. I clung to the belief that what I had done was right. In the end, they let me go, but not without a warning. "Disappear," Harding said, his voice dripping with menace. "Or next time, you won't be so lucky." I took his advice. I changed my name, moved to a small town far away, and tried to rebuild. The fear never fully left, but over time it dulled. I found a job, made new friends, and slowly the nightmare of my past began to fade. Years passed, and one day I received a letter. It was from the Reckoner. He survived too, and continued to fight from the shadows. The letter was filled with hope and encouragement, a reminder that the battle against injustice was far from over. I smiled as I read his words. Despite everything, we made a difference. Harding's empire had never fully recovered, and the world was a little bit more aware of the corruption that lurked beneath the surface. In the end, it wasn't the system that destroyed me. It was my own actions. But I found redemption in the fight for justice, and I stood in the warm sunlight of my new home, realizing that maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for the world.